Elliot Harper, a 38-year-old high school math teacher, sat at his kitchen table in his modest apartment in Erie, Pennsylvania. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional drip from a leaky faucet. It was the evening after his birthday, a quiet affair marked by a store-bought cake and a single card from his sister, who lived across the country in Seattle. The apartment smelled faintly of damp drywall and the lingering sweetness of vanilla frosting. Outside, a late September rain pattered against the windows, leaving streaks on the glass that blurred the streetlights into hazy orbs. Elliot rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of another year. His life was predictable: grading papers, teaching algebra to disinterested teenagers, and returning to this small, cluttered space that never quite felt like home. He'd always been a solitary man, not out of choice but necessity. His divorce 5 years ago had left him raw, the sting of rejection still lingering like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. He told himself he was fine, but the mirror in the bathroom showed a man with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed to sink deeper each year. As he sipped lukewarm coffee, Elliot's hand drifted to his throat, scratching absent-mindedly. A faint itch had started there earlier that day, just below his Adam's apple. He'd noticed it during his birthday lunch at the diner downtown, where he treated himself to a burger and fries. The itch was subtle, like a mosquito bite, and he dismissed it as irritation from his scarf or maybe a reaction to the cheap cologne he'd worn to feel festive. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, the sensation persisted, sharper than before. He pressed his fingers against the spot, expecting to feel nothing but smooth skin. Instead, there was a faint hardness, like a small pebble lodged beneath the surface. "Great," he muttered, shaking his head. "Probably just a swollen gland or something." He stood, stretching his arms, and wandered to the bathroom to inspect it. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked tiles. Leaning toward the mirror, he tilted his head and ran his fingers over his throat. The skin looked normal, no redness, no swelling, but the itch was maddening, like tiny claws scraping from the inside. He pressed harder, and for a moment, he swore he felt something shift, a subtle pulse that wasn't his heartbeat. He froze, his breath catching, but the sensation didn't repeat. "Get a grip, Elliot," he said, forcing a laugh. "It was probably nothing. Stress, maybe." He'd been working late, eating poorly, and the damp in the apartment wasn't doing him any favors. He grabbed a tube of hydrocortisone cream from the medicine cabinet, smeared a dab on his throat, and headed to bed, hoping sleep would dull the irritation. The next morning, Elliot woke to the sound of rain still tapping against the windows. His throat felt tighter, the itch now a faint burn, like he'd swallowed something sharp that had lodged there. He sat up, rubbing the spot, and noticed his fingers came away slightly sticky, though there was no visible residue. The air in the apartment carried a faint metallic tang, like pennies left out in the rain. He frowned, sniffing his hand, but the smell was gone as quickly as it came. Shaking it off, he dressed for work, pulling on a high-collared sweater to cover his neck. No need to draw attention to something so trivial. At Erie High School, the day dragged on. The fluorescent lights in his classroom flickered, casting long shadows across the rows of desks. His students, a mix of bored and restless teens, barely paid attention as he explained quadratic equations. During a lull, he caught himself scratching his throat again, the sensation now accompanied by a faint warmth, like a candle held too close to the skin. One of his students, a lanky kid named Tyler, squinted at him from the front row. "You okay, Mr. Harper? You look kinda pale," Tyler said, his tone half concerned, half mocking. Elliot forced a smile, his hand dropping from his neck. "Just a late night, Tyler. Focus on your worksheet." But Tyler's comment lingered. Elliot caught his reflection in the classroom window. His face did look paler, his eyes shadowed. The itch in his throat pulsed, almost rhythmic, like a second heartbeat. He swallowed hard, feeling a faint pressure, as if something was pressing against the inside of his windpipe. He excused himself to the bathroom, locking the door behind him. In the dim light, he pulled down his collar and leaned toward the mirror. The skin over his Adam's apple was unchanged, but when he pressed it, the hardness seemed larger, more defined, like a knuckle pushing back against his fingers. "Stress," he whispered, though the word felt hollow. He splashed cold water on his face, the droplets stinging his skin, and returned to class, determined to ignore it. But the sensation grew throughout the day, a nagging presence that made his throat feel foreign, like it belonged to someone else. That evening, Elliot sat at his kitchen table, grating papers under the weak glow of a desk lamp. The rain had stopped, but the apartment felt heavier, the air thick with the smell of damp carpet and something else. Something acrid, like burnt hair. He tried to focus, but his hand kept drifting to his throat, scratching until the skin felt raw. He stood, pacing the small living room, and caught a glimpse of himself in the darkened window. His reflection looked wrong. Too sharp, too angular, like a photograph slightly out of focus. He blinked, and the image snapped back to normal. "Enough," he said, grabbing his phone to distract himself. He scrolled through messages, finding a text from his coworker, Sarah, who'd wished him a happy birthday yesterday. "Hope you're doing okay, Elliot. You seemed off at the diner. Let me know if you need to talk." He stared at the words, a pang of guilt hitting him. Sarah was kind, one of the few who checked in on him, but he hadn't replied. He didn't know how to explain the weight he carried, the divorce, the loneliness, the fear that he was fading into the background of his own life. He typed a quick reply, "Thanks, just tired. All good," and set the phone down. The itch in his throat flared, now a deep, gnawing ache. He stumbled to the bathroom, flicking on the light. Leaning close to the mirror, he pulled his collar down and pressed his fingers against the spot. The hardness was unmistakable now, a small, irregular lump just below his Adam's apple. He swallowed, and the motion sent a sharp pain through his neck, followed by a faint, wet sound, like something shifting inside a soaked sponge. Elliot's heart pounded. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and angled it at his throat, hoping to see more clearly. The skin looked normal, but when he pressed harder, the lump seemed to writhe, a subtle movement that made his stomach lurch. He dropped the flashlight, his hands trembling, and backed away from the mirror. The apartment was silent except for the drip of the faucet and a faint, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from nowhere, or worse, from inside him. He sat on the edge of his bed, breathing shallowly, trying to rationalize it. A cyst, maybe. An infection. He'd see a doctor tomorrow. But as he lay down, the ache in his throat pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and in the darkness, he swore he heard a faint crack, like a bone splintering under pressure. His hand flew to his neck, but the skin was still smooth, still warm. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, but the sound lingered in his mind, a quiet, relentless crunch, like something inside his throat was waking up. Elliot Harper woke to the sound of his own ragged breathing, the air in his eerie apartment heavy with the scent of damp plaster and something sharper, like rusted iron. The clock on his nightstand read 5:47 a.m., the gray light of dawn barely seeping through the rain-streaked windows. His throat burned, the itch from last night now a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed with every swallow. He pressed his fingers to the spot below his Adam's apple, wincing as they met the same hard lump, now larger, the size of a walnut. The skin over it felt taut, unnaturally warm, like a fever localized to one small patch. He sat up, his heart hammering, and stumbled to the bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered, casting jagged shadows across the cracked tiles. Elliot leaned toward the mirror, pulling down the collar of his sweat-soaked t-shirt. The skin on his throat looked normal, no redness, no bruising, but when he pressed the lump, a sharp pain shot through his neck, followed by a faint, wet squelch, like stepping on a soaked sponge. His fingers came away slick, coated in a thin, grayish film that smelled faintly of burnt rubber. He gagged, wiping his hand on a towel, but the smell lingered, clinging to his skin like oil. "It's nothing," he whispered, though the words felt like a lie. He splashed cold water on his face, the droplets stinging like needles, and tried to focus on the day ahead. He had classes to teach, papers to grade. He couldn't afford to spiral over what was probably just a swollen gland or an allergic reaction. But as he dressed, pulling on a turtleneck to hide his throat, the ache intensified, radiating into his jaw. Each swallow felt like forcing a stone down a narrow pipe. At Erie High School, the day felt like a fever dream. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, and the classroom air was thick, carrying a faint mildew scent from the old building's ventilation. Elliot stood at the blackboard, scribbling equations, but his hand kept drifting to his throat, scratching until his nails left red welts. The lump seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, and once, during a quiet moment, he swore he felt it shift, like a finger pressing back from the inside. His students noticed his distraction. A girl named Mia raised her hand, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Harper, you okay? You keep, touching your neck." Elliot forced a smile, his voice hoarse. Just a sore throat, Mia. Let's focus on the lesson. But his words sounded thin, unconvincing. He turned away, pretending to erase the board, but his reflection in the classroom window caught his eye. His face looked gaunt, his skin almost translucent under the harsh light. The turtleneck hid the lump, but he could feel it growing, pressing against the fabric like a living thing. During lunch, he avoided the staff room, unable to face Sarah or the other teachers. Sarah had texted again that morning, "You sure you're okay? Looked rough yesterday." But he hadn't replied. The thought of her noticing the lump, or worse, smelling the faint chemical odor that seemed to follow him, filled him with dread. He ate alone in his car, parked in the school lot, the rain tapping on the windshield. The sandwich tasted metallic, like he'd licked a penny, and he spat it out, his stomach churning. When he checked his throat in the rearview mirror, he noticed a faint grayish tint to the skin, like a bruise forming deep beneath the surface. Back at home, the apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The air was thick with that same metallic tang, now mixed with a sickly sweetness, like rotting fruit. Elliot sat on the couch, staring at the TV without seeing it, his fingers tracing the lump. It was bigger now, unmistakably so, and the skin around it felt brittle, like dried parchment. He pressed harder, ignoring the pain, and felt something move, a slow, deliberate shift, like a worm curling under the surface. His breath hitched, and he yanked his hand away, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He grabbed his phone and searched for answers, typing "lump in throat" into Google. The results were a blur of medical terms: thyroid issues, cysts, infections, but none matched the strange sensations he was experiencing. The websites warned against self-diagnosis, urging a doctor's visit, but the thought of exposing his throat to a stranger filled him with a visceral shame. What if they saw it move? What if they smelled that awful odor? He imagined their faces twisting in disgust, their voices whispering behind his back. He'd always felt like an outsider. His divorce had only deepened that wound, and now his own body was betraying him, marking him as something grotesque. Instead, he rummaged through his medicine cabinet, finding an old bottle of antiseptic spray. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tilted his head back, and sprayed the lump, wincing as the liquid stung. The skin glistened under the light, and for a moment he thought he saw it ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. He blinked, and the effect was gone, but the ache deepened, spreading into his chest. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, telling himself it was to keep warm, but really it was to hide the thing that was no longer just a lump but something alive, something wrong. That night, he barely slept. The apartment was too quiet, the silence broken only by the drip of the faucet and an occasional creak from the walls, like the building itself was breathing. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his hand resting on his throat. The lump pulsed, slow and steady, and each pulse brought a faint sound, a soft, wet click, like teeth snapping shut. He tried to ignore it, closing his eyes, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to come from inside his skull. He sat up, sweating, and stumbled to the kitchen for water. As he drank, the liquid caught in his throat, refusing to go down. He coughed, a harsh, barking sound, and something warm and slick dribbled from his mouth. He wiped his lips, expecting saliva, but his fingers came away smeared with a thick, gray substance that smelled like burning plastic. He gagged, dropping the glass, which shattered on the floor. The substance clung to his fingers, viscous and warm, and when he tried to wash it off, it seemed to cling tighter, like it was burrowing into his skin. Panic clawed at him. He ran to the bathroom, flicking on the light, and yanked the scarf from his neck. The lump was larger now, the size of a plum, and the skin over it was stretched thin, almost translucent, revealing a network of dark, thread-like veins beneath. He pressed it, unable to stop himself, and the lump quivered, a slow, deliberate motion that made his knees buckle. He gripped the sink, staring into the mirror, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move inside the lump, a faint, shadowy shape, like a finger curling against the skin. Elliot staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room spun, the fluorescent light flickering like a dying star. He wanted to scream, to call someone. Sarah, his sister, anyone. But the thought of speaking, of opening his throat, filled him with terror. What if that thing moved again? What if it spoke? He sank to the floor, clutching his neck, the lump throbbing under his fingers. The air was thick with that chemical stench, and in the silence, he heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like a whisper trapped inside his throat, repeating a single word, Elliot. Elliot Harper hadn't left his apartment in 3 days. The lump in his throat had grown, a grotesque bulge now the size of a small fist, stretching the skin until it gleamed like wax paper. The air in his eerie apartment was thick with a rancid metallic stench, like blood mixed with motor oil, and the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own ragged breathing. The rain outside had stopped, but the windows remained fogged, trapping the dim streetlight in a haze that made the room feel like a sealed tomb. Every mirror in the apartment was covered with towels. He couldn't bear to look at himself anymore. The pain was constant now, a searing ache that radiated from his throat into his chest and jaw, as if something were clawing its way upward. The lump throbbed with a life of its own, each pulse accompanied by a wet, grinding sound, like bones rubbing together in a sack of meat. When he touched it, his fingers sank slightly into the skin, meeting resistance that felt alive, squirming, shifting, as if tiny tendrils were coiling beneath the surface. The grayish film from before had thickened, seeping from the lump in slow, viscous drips that left stains on his clothes, stains that smelled of decay and chemicals. Elliot sat on the edge of his couch, his hands trembling as he clutched a bottle of painkillers. He'd stopped going to work, texting Sarah a vague excuse about the flu. Her replies, "Feel better, Elliot. Let me know if you need anything," sat unanswered on his phone, each message a reminder of the world he was slipping away from. He couldn't face her, couldn't face anyone. The thought of someone seeing the lump, smelling its foul odor, or hearing the faint whispers that seemed to emanate from it filled him with a shame so deep it felt like drowning. He'd tried everything, antiseptics, ice packs, even prayer, though he hadn't believed in anything since childhood. Nothing helped. The lump grew larger, and the skin around it began to crack, revealing thin, dark lines that looked like veins but moved like worms, writhing just beneath the surface. He'd spent hours researching online, scrolling through medical forums until his eyes burned, but nothing explained the sensations. The feeling of something crawling inside his throat, the whispers that grew louder at night, or the dreams that plagued him. Visions of a shadowed figure with no face, its throat pulsing with a mass of writhing tendrils. Desperate, Elliot decided to see a doctor. He chose a walk-in clinic on the edge of town, a squat, gray building that smelled of bleach and despair. The waiting room was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing like dying insects. He kept his scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, his head bowed to avoid the receptionist's gaze. When his name was called, he shuffled into the exam room, his heart pounding. The doctor, a tired-looking man named Dr. Kessler, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Sore throat, you said?" Dr. Kessler asked, his voice flat. Elliot nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, and a lump. It's been getting worse." The doctor gestured for him to remove the scarf. Elliot hesitated, his hands shaking as he unwound the fabric. The air felt cold against his throat, and he heard a faint gasp from Dr. Kessler as the lump came into view. The skin was now mottled gray and purple, with tiny cracks oozing a thick, blackish fluid that smelled like rotting meat. The doctor leaned closer, his face tightening, and Elliot caught a whiff of his own odor, a mix of decay and something sharp, like ammonia. "It's unusual," Dr. Kessler said, his voice careful. "Could be a cyst, maybe an abscess. We'll need imaging, maybe a biopsy." He pressed a gloved finger against the lump, and Elliot yelped as a sharp pain shot through him, followed by a sickening squelch. The lump pulsed violently, and for a moment, Elliot thought he heard a faint, guttural sound, like a growl trapped in his throat. Dr. Kessler pulled back, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. The doctor shook his head, but his expression betrayed him. "I'll order a CT scan. For now, keep it clean. I'll prescribe antibiotics." He scribbled a prescription and practically shoved Elliot out of the room, his hands shaking as he closed the door. The antibiotics did nothing. By the next morning, the lump had grown again, now protruding like a grotesque second chin. The cracks in the skin had widened, and the black fluid seeped constantly, staining his shirts and leaving a sticky residue on his fingers. The pain was unbearable, a burning pressure that made it hard to swallow or speak. Worse were the sounds. Those wet, grinding clicks had become a constant hum, punctuated by sharp snaps, like twigs breaking inside his throat. At night, the whispers returned, clearer now, forming words he couldn't quite make out but that filled him with dread. Elliot's apartment became a prison. The walls seemed to sweat, the air thick with that rancid stench. He stopped answering his phone, ignoring Sarah's increasingly worried texts. The world outside felt distant, unreal, as if the lump were pulling him into some other reality, one where his body was no longer his own. He began to wonder if it was a punishment. Maybe for his failed marriage, for the years he'd spent pushing people away, for the guilt he carried like a stone in his chest. He'd always felt like he wasn't enough, and now his body was confirming it, turning him into something monstrous. In a moment of desperation, he tried to treat it himself. He stood in the bathroom, the light flickering, and poured rubbing alcohol over the lump. The liquid hissed as it touched the skin, and the pain was so intense he nearly blacked out. The lump quivered, and a thin, black tendril, barely thicker than a hair, pushed through one of the cracks, writhing like a worm caught in the light. Elliot screamed, dropping the bottle, and stumbled back, his vision swimming. The tendril retracted, but the lump pulsed faster, as if angered by his attempt to fight it. He sank to the floor, sobbing, his hands clutching his throat. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of unintelligible voices that seemed to come from inside the lump itself. He closed his eyes, and the dreams returned. Only they weren't dreams anymore. The shadowed figure stood at the edge of his vision, its throat a writhing mass of tendrils that pulsed in time with his own. It reached for him, its fingers cold and slick, and he woke with a scream, his throat burning as if he'd swallowed fire. He crawled to the mirror, tearing off the towel he'd draped over it. The lump was no longer just a lump. It was a grotesque, pulsating mass. The skin stretched so thin he could see shapes moving beneath it, like tiny limbs pressing against a membrane. He pressed his fingers against it, unable to stop himself, and the lump split open with a wet pop, releasing a flood of black, viscous fluid that splattered the sink. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of rot and chemicals that made his eyes water. And then he saw it, a small, glistening shape, like a tiny, malformed eye, staring up at him from the center of the wound. Elliot staggered back, his scream caught in his throat. The eye blinked, slow and deliberate, and the whispers grew louder, forming a single chilling word. Mine. Elliot Harper hadn't left his apartment in a week. The air inside his eerie home was suffocating, thick with a stench like rotting meat and burnt wiring, a smell that seemed to seep from his own throat. The lump, no longer just a lump but a grotesque, pulsating mass, had consumed the lower half of his neck, stretching the skin until it split in jagged tears, revealing a writhing, glistening surface beneath. The apartment's walls, streaked with condensation, seemed to pulse in time with the thing in his throat, and the dim light from a single bulb cast shadows that twisted like living things. Every mirror remained covered, but Elliot could feel the monstrosity his body was becoming. The pain was relentless, a burning, tearing sensation that clawed through his chest and up into his skull. The mass throbbed with a rhythm that wasn't his heartbeat, each pulse accompanied by a sickening crunch, like cartilage grinding against bone. The black fluid that had once seeped from the cracks now flowed freely, pooling in his collarbone and staining his clothes with a sticky, tar-like residue that reeked of decay and chemicals. Worse were the movements, tiny, deliberate shifts beneath the skin, like fingers probing for a way out. The eye he'd seen last night, small and malformed, had vanished, but he felt its gaze, as if it were watching him from within. Elliot sat on the floor, his back against the couch, his hands trembling as he clutched a kitchen knife. He hadn't eaten in days. Food tasted like ash, and swallowing was agony, as if the mass were squeezing his windpipe shut. He hadn't answered his phone, though it buzzed with messages from Sarah and his sister, their words a distant echo of a life he no longer recognized. The world outside his apartment felt like a dream, unreachable, while the thing in his throat was all too real, a parasite that was rewriting his body into something alien. He'd stopped believing it was a medical condition. No cyst or infection could explain the whispers, those low, guttural voices that filled the silence of his apartment, forming words he couldn't quite grasp but that chilled his blood. They were loudest at night, a chorus of murmurs that seemed to come from the mass itself, as if it were speaking to him. He saw the shadowed figure in his dreams again, its throat a writhing nest of tendrils, its face a blank void that mirrored his own growing sense of erasure. Was this punishment? For his failed marriage, for the years he'd spent hiding from the world, for the shame he carried like a second skin? The thought gnawed at him, as relentless as the pain. In a moment of madness, Elliot decided to fight back. He staggered to the bathroom, the knife shaking in his hand. The air was heavy with that rancid stench, and the flickering light cast his shadow like a distorted caricature. He tore the towel from the mirror, forcing himself to look. The mass had spread, covering his throat and creeping onto his jaw. The skin split open to reveal a pulsating, fleshy surface studded with tiny, writhing shapes, tendrils, or perhaps limbs, curling like worms in wet soil. The sight made his stomach lurch, and he gagged, tasting blood and something bitter, like battery acid. He raised the knife, his breath shallow, and pressed the blade against the mass. The skin parted easily, too easily, releasing a flood of black fluid that splattered the sink and filled the room with a stench so foul he nearly vomited. The mass quivered, and a low, guttural sound, like a moan, came from within, vibrating through his chest. He pressed harder, cutting deeper, and something moved, a thin, black tendril, slick and glistening, that shot out from the wound and wrapped around the knife, yanking it from his hand. The blade clattered to the floor, and Elliot screamed, stumbling back as the tendril retracted, leaving a gaping wound that pulsed with unnatural life. He collapsed, his vision swimming, the pain so intense it felt like his throat was splitting in two. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to mock him, chanting words he couldn't understand but that felt like accusations. He clutched his head, trying to drown them out, but they were inside him, part of him, as if the mass had burrowed into his mind as well as his body. The apartment seemed to warp around him, the walls bending inward, the shadows stretching into claw-like shapes that reached for him. The air was thick, almost liquid, and every breath tasted of rot. Elliot crawled to the living room, his strength fading. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, hadn't seen daylight, hadn't felt human. The mass was changing him, not just physically but fundamentally, as if it were erasing the man he'd been and replacing him with something else. He thought of his ex-wife, her disappointed eyes, the way she'd called him empty before she left. Maybe she was right. Maybe this thing was filling that emptiness, claiming the parts of him he'd never known how to use. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and he fell against the coffee table, knocking over a glass that shattered on the floor. The sound was drowned out by a new noise, a low, rhythmic hum, like a heartbeat but slower, heavier, coming from his throat. He clawed at the mass, his nails tearing into the cracked skin, and felt something shift, a hard, bulbous shape that pulsed against his fingers. He froze, his breath catching, as the shape moved, pressing outward until the skin split further, revealing a cluster of tiny, glistening forms, like insect legs twitching in the light. Elliot screamed, his voice hoarse and distorted, as if the mass were strangling his vocal cords. He staggered to the window, desperate for air, for escape, but the glass was fogged, the world outside a blur of gray. He pressed his face against it, the cold stinging his skin, and saw his reflection, or what should have been his reflection. The figure staring back wasn't him. Its face was a blank, featureless void, its throat a writhing mass of tendrils that pulsed in time with the thing in his own neck. Its mouth opened, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the light, and it spoke a single word in a voice that wasn't human. Ours. Elliot stumbled back, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. The apartment spun, the shadows closing in, and the hum from his throat grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He fell to his knees, clutching the mass, and felt it pulse faster, as if it were feeding on his fear. The tendrils beneath the skin writhed, and the whispers returned louder, clearer, forming a sentence that chilled his blood. You are no longer you. Elliot Harper sat in the sterile glow of the Erie County Medical Center's waiting room, his scarf wrapped tightly around his throat despite the stifling warmth. The air smelled of disinfectant, sharp and clinical, but it couldn't mask the faint, rancid odor that clung to him, a mix of rotting flesh and burnt plastic that seemed to seep from the pulsating mass in his neck. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for an elderly man coughing into a handkerchief and a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a trapped fly. Elliot's hands trembled in his lap, his fingers stained with a black, tar-like fluid that had become a constant companion, oozing from the cracks in his skin. He hadn't slept in days, haunted by the whispers, those guttural, inhuman voices that called him ours, and the memory of the featureless figure in his reflection. The mass in his throat had grown monstrous, a throbbing, fleshy growth that distorted his jawline and pressed against his windpipe, making every breath a struggle. The skin over it was split wide, revealing a writhing surface studded with tiny, twitching tendrils that glistened like wet obsidian. The pain was unbearable, a burning, tearing sensation that felt like his throat was being ripped apart from the inside. Worse were the sounds, wet, grinding crunches and faint, rhythmic hums that seemed to vibrate through his bones. He'd stopped looking in mirrors, stopped answering his phone, stopped believing he could escape the thing that was rewriting his body into something alien. But desperation had driven him here, to this hospital, after days of hiding in his apartment, where the walls seemed to sweat and the shadows whispered his name. He'd found Dr. Kessler's referral slip crumpled in his pocket, the words "urgent" and "biopsy" scrawled in hasty ink. The thought of surgery terrified him. What if they cut into the mass and it fought back, as it had when he tried with a knife? But the alternative was worse. He could feel himself slipping away, his thoughts fragmented by pain and fear, his identity eroded by the thing that claimed him as its own. If there was a chance, any chance, to stop it, he had to try. The nurse called his name, her voice clipped and professional. Elliot shuffled into the exam room, his scarf still in place, though it did little to hide the bulge that pulsed beneath. The doctor, a wiry woman named Dr. Patel, glanced at him with a practiced smile that faltered when he unwound the scarf. The mass was impossible to ignore, a grotesque, pulsating growth that seemed to writhe under her gaze. The skin was mottled, gray and purple, with cracks oozing black fluid that dripped onto the exam table, leaving dark, sticky stains. The air filled with that rancid stench, and Dr. Patel's nose wrinkled before she caught herself. "This is highly unusual," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying unease. "We'll need to operate immediately. It could be a tumor, but the presentation is unlike anything I've seen. We'll take a biopsy during surgery and run tests." Elliot nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The mass pulsed, and he swore he heard a low, guttural hum, like a warning. Dr. Patel didn't seem to notice, but her hands moved quickly, scheduling an emergency procedure for that afternoon. As he left the room, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to twist into claw-like shapes. The hospital felt wrong, too clean, too bright, as if it were hiding something beneath its sterile facade. The surgery took place in a cold, white operating room that smelled of antiseptic and metal. Elliot lay on the table, his heart pounding as the anesthesiologist adjusted in 4. The mass throbbed, each pulse sending a jolt of pain through his chest. As the anesthesia took hold, his vision blurred, and he saw it again, the shadowed figure from his dreams, its throat a writhing nest of tendrils, its blank face staring down at him. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness creeping over him. He woke in a recovery room, his throat bandaged, his body heavy with painkillers. The air was cool, the beeping of monitors a steady rhythm that grounded him. For the first time in weeks, the pain was dulled, the throbbing gone. He reached for his throat, expecting the familiar bulge, but felt only tight bandages and a faint ache. Relief washed over him, fragile and unfamiliar, like sunlight after a storm. He closed his eyes, tears leaking down his cheeks, and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since childhood. Dr. Patel visited later, her expression guarded. "The surgery went well," she said. "We removed a large mass, unlike anything I've encountered. It was complex, almost organic in a way that didn't seem natural. We've sent it for analysis, but it's gone for now. You'll need follow-up tests, and we'll monitor for infection." Elliot nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's gone? Really?" "For now," she repeated, her tone cautious. "Rest, Mr. Harper. We'll know more soon." He returned home that evening, the apartment feeling strangely empty without the constant hum of the mass. The air still carried a faint metallic tang, but it was fainter, overshadowed by the smell of damp carpet and old coffee. He avoided the bathroom mirror, afraid of what he might see, but the bandages on his throat felt like a shield, a promise of normalcy. He texted Sarah, feeling better, just needed rest, and even called his sister, leaving a voicemail that sounded almost cheerful. For the first time in weeks, he slept without dreams, the silence a balm to his frayed nerves. The next day, he ventured outside, the autumn air crisp against his skin. The streets of Erie were quiet, the lake visible in the distance, its surface glinting under a gray sky. He walked to a coffee shop, ordered a latte, and sat by the window, watching people pass by. They seemed so normal, so untouched, and he envied them, even as he clung to the hope that he could be one of them again. The bandages itched, but he resisted touching them, afraid to disrupt the fragile peace. But the hospital's cleanliness, the coffee shop's warmth, couldn't erase the lingering dread. At night, alone in his apartment, Elliot felt the weight of the silence, heavier than before. The walls still seemed to sweat, the shadows too long, too sharp. He caught himself listening for the whispers, expecting the hum to return. He told himself it was over, that the surgery had saved him, but the scars beneath the bandages ached, a dull reminder of what had been. On the third night, he woke with a start, his chest tight. The apartment was dark, the only sound the drip of the faucet and a faint, rhythmic creak from the walls. He reached for his throat, expecting the comfort of the bandages, but his fingers brushed something else. A faint, hard bump, no larger than a pea, just below the surgical scar. His breath caught, his heart pounding as he pressed harder. The bump pulsed, slow and deliberate, and a faint, familiar smell, burnt plastic and rot, filled the air. Elliot stumbled to the bathroom, flicking on the light. He tore at the bandages, his hands shaking, and stared into the mirror. The surgical scar was red and raw, but the new bump was unmistakable, its surface glistening with a thin film of gray fluid. As he watched, it quivered, and a low, guttural hum vibrated through his chest, accompanied by a single chilling word, again. Elliot Harper stood in his eerie apartment, the air heavy with the scent of damp plaster and a faint, lingering trace of burnt plastic. It was 2 weeks since his surgery, and the scars on his throat, jagged red lines where the mass had been carved out, itched under the dim light of his desk lamp. The new bump he discovered, that small pulsing knot below the surgical scar, had not grown since that terrifying night, but its presence was a constant reminder, a whisper of dread that kept him from sleep. Outside, a soft rain fell, the droplets tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The apartment felt quieter now, the oppressive hum of the mass gone, but the silence was not comforting. It was a void, waiting to be filled. Elliot had returned to work at Erie High School, forcing himself to step back into the rhythm of normalcy. The fluorescent lights in his classroom still buzzed, casting shadows that seemed to linger too long, but his students no longer stared at him with concern. He wore high-collared shirts to hide the scars, and he'd mastered a tight smile when Sarah, his coworker, asked how he was feeling. "Better," he'd say, the word tasting like a lie. Sarah had stopped by his apartment once, bringing a casserole, her eyes lingering on his pale face and trembling hands. "You sure you're okay, Elliot?" she'd asked, and he'd nodded, ushering her out before she could notice the faint metallic tang in the air. The hospital had called with test results, but the answers were vague. The mass was organic, but not cancerous, Dr. Patel had said over the phone, her voice clipped. "We couldn't identify its composition, some kind of abnormal tissue growth. Keep monitoring for changes." The ambiguity gnawed at Elliot, feeding his paranoia. He avoided mirrors, afraid to see the shadowed figure from his dreams, its throat a writhing nest of tendrils, its blank face a mockery of his own. The whispers had stopped, but he still heard them in his mind, a faint echo of hours that surfaced in the quiet moments before sleep. He tried to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He called his sister, promising to visit her in Seattle someday, though the thought of leaving Erie filled him with dread, as if the thing in his throat might follow him, or worse, awaken. He went to the coffee shop downtown, sat by the window, and watched the lake in the distance, its surface rippling under the gray sky. The world felt normal again, almost painfully so, but it was a fragile normalcy, like a thin sheet of ice over dark water. Every itch, every twinge in his throat sent his heart racing, his fingers probing the scar for signs of the bump growing, pulsing, returning. At night, the apartment was a different world. The walls, still streaked with condensation, seemed to breathe, their surfaces glistening in the low light. The faucet dripped, a steady rhythm that echoed the pulse he'd once felt in his throat. He kept the mirrors covered, but sometimes in the darkness, he caught glimpses of movement. Shadows that shifted too quickly, shapes that didn't match his own. The air carried a faint, acrid smell, like rust or blood, and he wondered if it was real or a memory burned into his senses. He slept with the lights on, afraid of what the darkness might bring. One evening, he sat at his kitchen table, grating papers under the flickering bulb. His throat itched, a faint, nagging sensation that made his fingers twitch. He resisted touching it, focusing instead on the equations scrawled in his student's handwriting. But the itch grew, sharp and insistent, and he felt a familiar warmth, like a fever blooming beneath the scar. His breath caught, and he dropped his pen, his hand flying to his throat. The bump was still there, small and hard, but it hadn't grown, or had it? He pressed harder, wincing at the dull ache, and felt a faint pulse, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat not his own. He stumbled to the bathroom, his heart pounding, and hesitated before pulling the towel from the mirror. The fluorescent light buzzed, casting his face in a sickly glow. The scars were red and raw, crisscrossing his throat like a map of his suffering. The bump was barely visible, a slight bulge beneath the skin, but when he touched it, it quivered, a subtle movement that made his stomach lurch. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and for a moment, he thought he saw something, a faint, dark shape beneath the skin, like a shadow curling in on itself. Elliot backed away, his hands shaking. He wanted to believe it was over, that the surgery had saved him, but the bump was proof that the thing, whatever it was, hadn't left. It was dormant, perhaps, but not gone. He thought of the mass they'd removed, its writhing tendrils and glistening eye, and wondered if it had been alive, if it had known him, claimed him. The dreams came flooding back, the shadowed figure, its throat pulsing with life, its voice whispering hours. Was it still inside him, waiting, watching? He sank to the floor, his back against the cold tiles, and closed his eyes. The apartment was quiet, but the silence felt alive, charged with a tension he couldn't shake. He thought of his life before the mass, his loneliness, his guilt, the divorce that had left him hollow. The thing in his throat had felt like a punishment, a manifestation of the shame he'd carried for years, but now, in its absence, he felt no lighter. The emptiness remained, and the bump was a reminder that it could return, that it might never leave him. He forced himself to stand, to move. He walked to the living room, opened the window, and let the cool night air wash over him. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clear, the stars faint against the glow of the city. He breathed deeply, the air tasting of lake water and distant smoke. For a moment, he felt almost human again, almost whole. He wanted to believe he could move forward, that he could reclaim his life, but the itch in his throat lingered, a quiet warning. Elliot returned to work the next day, his smile a little steadier, his voice a little stronger. He laughed with Sarah over lunch, graded papers with focus, even planned a lesson on calculus that felt almost exciting. But at night, alone in his apartment, he sat in the dark, listening to the drip of the faucet and the faint creak of the walls. He avoided the bathroom, avoided touching his throat, but he couldn't escape the sensation, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat stirring beneath the scar. As he lay in bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The silence was heavy, but not empty. In the stillness, he heard it, a faint, wet crunch like bones shifting in his chest, followed by a whisper so soft it might have been his imagination. Always. He sat up, his heart racing, and pressed his hand to his throat. The bump was still there, small and hard, but it pulsed once, sharply, as if acknowledging his touch. Elliot stared out the window, where the rain had started again, the droplets dark and heavy, glinting like oil in the streetlight's glow. He wondered if he was free, or if the thing in his throat was merely waiting, biding its time. The scars on his neck ached, a reminder of what he'd endured, and the bump pulsed faintly, a promise of what might come. He lay back down, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, and listened to the rain, its rhythm echoing the pulse in his throat, a sound that was both his and not his, a shadow that would never fully fade.